The courtroom air crackled, thick with unspoken threats and the weight of unchecked power. Judge Ronald Gentry, a man accustomed to wielding authority like a sharpened blade, smirked. He thought he could silence a U.S. Congresswoman with a condescending jab, a casual dismissal. He was wrong, dead wrong, because Jasmine Crockett didn't just bring her voice. She brought receipts, literal, damning evidence that would shatter his carefully constructed world. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning, a moment where the scales of justice tipped, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, undeniable power of truth. He thought mocking a congresswoman in front of a packed courtroom would silence her. He didn't realize she came prepared with evidence that would land him in handcuffs before the hearing ended. It wasn't just any Tuesday morning in Dallas. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B. It was barely 9:05 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett walked in, not rushed, not rattled, just composed like she knew something the rest of the room didn't. She wore a deep navy pantsuit, sharp lines, no frills. Her natural curls were pulled back into a soft bun, not a strand out of place. She looked like exactly what she was, a U.S. Congresswoman who wasn't there to impress anyone, just to speak the truth. The case was already a mess. A real estate mogul named Perry Knoll had been accused of laundering campaign donations through phony contractors. Big money, big names, a lot of people had something to lose if this came out. Jasmine had been called as a witness after records showed her office had unknowingly received one of the campaign donations connected to the scheme. But that wasn't why everyone was staring. They were staring because the judge presiding over the case, Judge Ronald Gentry, was known for one thing: control. Old school, stiff collar, no nonsense, but with a temper just under the surface. He'd been on the bench for over 25 years, and some said he'd grown too comfortable, too sure no one would ever challenge him. Jasmine took her seat at the witness table. A few rows behind her, her legal aide, Rena Dalton, sat with a worn leather folder tucked close. Two federal agents, plain clothes, stood near the back. They blended in unless you knew what to look for. Tight jaw lines, eyes scanning everyone, unmoving. The courtroom buzzed with tension, but it wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet that feels loaded, a pause in the air, everyone waiting for something to snap. When Judge Gentry finally appeared, he didn't look at Jasmine, not once. He adjusted his robe, glanced at the defendant, and looked bored. But the moment Jasmine's name was called, he gave a smirk, barely there, but enough to notice. "You may proceed, Congresswoman," he said, voice dry like sandpaper. "Try to keep it concise. We don't need political speeches here." There was a soft rustle in the gallery. A few people shifted, eyebrows raised. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Your Honor. I intend to speak only to what I witnessed," she said. She began her testimony, measured, clear. She explained the day her office flagged a campaign contribution that didn't add up, how her chief of staff had raised questions, how they reported it, and moved forward. But Judge Gentry wasn't listening, not really. He kept interrupting. "So you're saying you didn't catch it sooner? You expect us to believe that slipped past a sitting member of Congress." He was baiting her, looking for a stumble, a crack in her tone. But Jasmine didn't give him one. Her voice stayed level. She answered every question, even the sharp ones, without hesitation. Then came a comment. "And tell me, Miss Crockett," the judge said, dragging out the miss like an insult, "did your staff miss it because they were too busy picking out your wardrobe for the press briefings?" For a second, it went completely silent. Even the court reporter looked up. Jasmine stared at him, one beat, too. "I'm not sure if that's a question, Your Honor," she replied, "but I'd be happy to answer when you ask something relevant." A couple of muffled chuckles echoed from the back. The judge's mouth tightened, but he moved on. Still, the damage was done. The line had been crossed. Something had shifted in the room. Jasmine glanced back toward Rena. No nods, no gestures, just the folder now sitting on the bench beside her. But Jasmine didn't react the way people expected her to, not yet. She was waiting for the right moment, and it was coming. Judge Gentry leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching with something between smugness and annoyance. He'd always been the smartest man in the room, or at least that's what he told himself. But as he shuffled through papers and cleared his throat for the third time, it was clear he expected Jasmine to fold. She didn't. In fact, her silence had weight. She wasn't trying to win the room. She was reading it, watching, calculating. The jab about her wardrobe had landed like a slap in the face, not just to her, but to every woman who ever had to defend her presence in a room full of men trying to make her small. The judge called for a 5-minute recess to realign the schedule, but no one was fooled. He needed air, or maybe a mirror. The moment the gavel tapped, people stood too quickly. Jasmine stayed seated. She didn't check her phone, didn't speak. She just glanced at the folder next to Rena again, and this time Rena gave the smallest, slowest nod. Inside that folder wasn't gossip. It wasn't a last-ditch move or a bluff. It was research, connections, names, wire transfers. It had taken 2 retired investigators and a former IRS analyst 5 weeks to pull it together quietly. Jasmine hadn't intended to use it. She came to testify truthfully, fairly, without agenda. But when someone uses their seat of power to insult you in front of a packed courtroom, when they weaponize authority to degrade and distract, intentions change. When the judge returned, he looked refreshed, maybe too refreshed, like he'd just convinced himself he'd regained control. "Let's continue," he said. "Miss Crockett, kindly pick up where you left off, assuming there are no more fashion-related concerns." There was again smirking behind protocol. Jasmine didn't even look at him. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth. "Before I continue, I respectfully request permission to enter a short statement into the official record." That stopped him. Gentry looked up, skeptical. "This isn't a hearing for speeches, Congresswoman." "It's not a speech," she replied. "It's a request directly related to the integrity of these proceedings." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. So did the defense attorney. The room shifted again, still like a held breath. Judge Gentry hesitated. "Go ahead," he muttered. Rena stood up and walked toward the witness stand, holding the folder. She didn't say a word as she handed it to Jasmine, but the way she moved, measured, purposeful, made every eye follow her. Jasmine opened the folder slowly, as if every page inside mattered. She placed it on the table, kept one hand on top of it, and looked at the judge. "Before I continue, I want to clarify something," she said, loud enough for the courtroom to hear clearly. "The defendant in this case, Mr. Knoll, made a number of questionable contributions and received protections from people in powerful positions. That's what this trial is about. But what hasn't been addressed are the relationships behind those protections." The judge's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough that his left eye twitched. "Congresswoman, be very careful with what you are implying." "I'm not implying anything," she said calmly. "I'm reading directly from verified documents." She opened to the first page. In 2019, Mr. Knoll funneled $40,000 to a group of consulting firms linked to a real estate lobbying coalition. That coalition, in turn, hired the law offices of Gentry, Lee, and Broderick. Before Your Honor returned to the bench, he blinked. "I fail to see how this." She turned the page. In 2020, Mr. Knoll's firm purchased a parcel of land through a third-party holding company. That land had previously been in escrow under the name of Gentry Real Holdings, LLC. The transaction closed during Your Honor's second term on the bench. Now the courtroom was dead silent. I have records of these transactions, as well as emails showing direct correspondence between Mr. Knoll's office and Your Honor's legal assistant, dated just 6 months before this case was assigned. The judge's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "Miss Crockett, Congresswoman," she corrected, finally looking him in the eye. But she wasn't done, not even close, and every word that followed would dig deeper than anyone in that room was ready for. You could almost hear the air in the room shift. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the creak of a bench, just stillness, as if everyone was afraid that the smallest movement would shatter the moment. Judge Gentry sat motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was biting through his own tongue. Across the room, the bailiff subtly adjusted his stance, eyes darting between the judge and Jasmine, like he wasn't sure who needed protection. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm made the words hit harder. The folder set open in front of her, pages marked with color-coded tabs. No theatrics, no outbursts, just facts, stacked, sorted, documented. "I'd like to continue reading into the record," she said, looking back down. Judge Gentry didn't respond. "Your Honor," she repeated. His voice was barely audible. "Proceed." She flipped to the next page and read from a notarized affidavit. "This is a sworn statement from accountant Beverly Arnett, who was contracted by one of Mr. Knoll's companies. She confirms that she was ordered to disguise recurring payments made to a personal consulting firm registered under the name G.R. Holdings." She paused and looked up. "Those are your initials, are they not, Your Honor?" Gentry didn't answer. His gaze was locked on some invisible point in the distance. His right hand moved to his collar, tugging slightly. From the back of the room, one of the plainclothes agents took a step forward, small, almost unnoticeable, but Jasmine saw it. So did Rena. Neither said a word. The judge tried to regain control. "These are serious accusations being made in the middle of a federal trial," he said, his voice sharper now, louder, without any prior motion or basis. "They are not accusations. They are records, receipts, bank statements, timelines," Jasmine said. "If you'd like to strike them from the record, you'll have to explain why." He shifted in his seat. For the first time in his career, Gentry looked like a man who didn't know which words to reach for. The prosecutor stood up slowly. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "I request a short recess to review these documents." "No," Jasmine said, turning her attention to him. "I believe the room deserves the full picture now, especially since this judge has been actively interrupting and insulting me since I took the stand." "Objection," the defense attorney tried, but no one backed him, not even the judge. Jasmine continued. "In this folder are 14 documented instances of financial interactions between the defendant and entities directly or indirectly tied to the Honorable Ronald Gentry," she said. 3 of them involve gifts or unreported financial benefits within the last 5 years. She placed her hand on the last page, then looked back up. "Your Honor, do you have any financial interest in the outcome of this trial?" Gentry opened his mouth, but nothing came out, not a denial, not an excuse, just a pause too long to be honest. From the back, another agent moved forward, this time walking halfway down the aisle before stopping behind the last row. Now, people were shifting slowly, carefully. Phones appeared in hands. A couple of reporters began scribbling in notebooks. The defense attorney leaned over to whisper something into the judge's ear, but Gentry waved him off. "I have no," he began, but Jasmine raised a hand. "Before you answer, Your Honor, I'd like to formally submit these materials for review by the U.S. Attorney's Office, copies of which were delivered to them this morning." That landed like a hammer. The second plainclothes agent, taller, broader, joined the first, now both standing near the center aisle. The judge stared at them for a long second, then looked back at Jasmine. His face was a war zone. Confusion, anger, fear, and something else, realization. She closed the folder slowly. "This is not about revenge," she said. "It's about accountability, even when it sits in the highest seat in the room." But what happened next didn't come from Jasmine, and that's what made it even more shocking. The judge's lips parted, like he was about to speak, but the words never came. You could almost see the weight of every name, every figure, every time, stamp pressing down on him. Sweat had started to form along his hairline, betraying the cool front he'd tried to keep up. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't gloat. She just watched, still as ever. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if the Congresswoman's statement is accurate, this presents a serious conflict of interest. At the very least, I believe it warrants a formal recusal." Judge Gentry's eyes darted from the prosecutor to the defense table. The defendant, Perry Knoll, sat stiff in his seat, jaw clamped tight. He'd gone pale. Suddenly, his high-priced legal team was no longer whispering. They were motioning frantically to each other, flipping through their own paperwork, faces drawn tight. "I am the presiding judge in this courtroom," Gentry snapped, but even his voice cracked on the last word. Yes, Jasmine replied quietly, and that's exactly why this has to happen the right way. She reached into the folder again and lifted out a small bundle of printed emails stapled together. These are communications between the defendant's assistant and a law clerk assigned to your office, dated 3 weeks before the trial began. They discuss scheduling delays, procedural advantages, and, this is key, the desire to avoid having certain witnesses, myself included, appear early in the trial. She paused to let the implication settle. Meaning, she continued, there was prior coordination between your office and the defendant's team about how this trial should play out. The defense team erupted. This is absurd, the lead attorney barked. Completely fabricated. But Jasmine cut in, calm as ever. If you believe the emails are fabricated, I encourage your team to request a digital forensics audit. These documents were retrieved through a lawful subpoena and confirmed by 2 independent analysts. That shut him up. By now, everyone. The room had fully shifted. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a moment, a reckoning. From the gallery, phones were up. Reporters texted furiously. One older man in the third row whispered, "Is this really happening?" Judge Gentry adjusted his robe, then removed his glasses slowly and set them on the bench, like he needed a break from seeing. I need to speak with counsel," he muttered. "With all due respect," Jasmine replied, "you don't get to make procedural calls while under investigation." Her words were pointed, but not emotional, and that's what made them hit harder. She wasn't grandstanding. She was exposing the bones beneath the floor. The lead prosecutor took one look at the agents standing quietly at the back of the room, then turned to Gentry. "Your Honor, at this time, I'm formally requesting a suspension of proceedings pending judicial review and an immediate recess for federal oversight." He glanced back at Jasmine, almost like he was asking permission with his eyes, but she didn't give him anything. This wasn't her show. She just brought the truth. What they did with it was now up to them. Gentry stared down at the folder still lying on the table. "You think you can walk in here and dismantle a 25-year career with a few printed pages?" he said, his voice low. "No, Jasmine replied. Your actions did that. I just brought the receipts." It was the kind of line people would quote later on Twitter, in news segments, on talk shows, but Jasmine hadn't rehearsed it. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to set a line in stone. The judge slowly stood up, gripping the edge of the bench, as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Court is in recess," he said, and began gathering his papers with trembling hands. But before he could take a step off the platform, the shorter of the 2 agents walked forward, flashing his badge. "Judge Gentry," he said, "we need to speak with you immediately. Please step away from the bench." But what happened in the next 60 seconds would leave even seasoned legal veterans speechless, and there was no coming back from it. Judge Gentry stood frozen. The courtroom, once buzzing with formality and routine, had slipped into something else entirely. No gavels, no posturing, just a federal agent standing 5 feet from the bench with a badge in one hand and authority in the other. "You going to do this here?" Gentry asked. His voice caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. "In my courtroom?" The taller agent joined his partner, stepping in line with practiced ease. His eyes didn't blink. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We're executing a federal detainment order issued this morning by the Office of the Inspector General." The judge's face lost its color. He looked around as if hoping anyone, would object, would remind these agents who he was. But no one spoke, not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not even the defendant's legal team. Everyone knew what they were witnessing had weight. It wasn't just rare, it was nearly unheard of. "I want to consult my attorney," Gentry said, reaching for his phone. "Respectfully, sir," the agent said as he stepped forward, "you'll have the opportunity to do that once we transport you to the district field office. For now, we ask that you comply peacefully." The judge's hand stopped midair. Then, slowly, he placed it down, fingers tapping nervously on the polished wood. It was the most unsteady he had ever looked, and Jasmine Crockett was still seated, silent, unflinching, watching it all unfold without a trace of satisfaction. Gentry stepped down from the bench. His robe caught on the corner of his chair, forcing him to tug it loose awkwardly. That single moment, the clumsy pull, humanized him in the worst way, not as a figure of respect or wisdom, but as a man who had finally run out of cover. The agents flanked him gently but firmly. One reached for the cuffs, while the other issued the formal Miranda warning. "You have the right to remain silent." The words, so often recited like background noise in crime dramas, suddenly felt jarring, real, too real. Phones were up again. The reporters didn't even bother being discreet anymore. You could almost hear camera shutters clicking over the hush. One woman near the back put her hand over her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God," before realizing she'd said it aloud. As the cuffs locked into place behind his back, Judge Gentry didn't speak, didn't look at anyone, just stared down at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. The bailiff didn't move. He just watched, maybe in shock, maybe in agreement. The agents began escorting him toward the side door, where a separate corridor led directly to a secure vehicle entrance. One of them paused to radio in confirmation. "One in custody, code 304 confirmed, preparing transport." Jasmine finally stood. No fist pump, no smug smile, just poise. She glanced once at Rena, who was already collecting the folder. Then she turned to the prosecutor. "I hope the case can proceed fairly now." The prosecutor, still visibly stunned, nodded. "Congresswoman, I had no idea." "I know," she said quietly. Perry Knoll looked over his shoulder at the chaos unfolding and muttered something to his attorney. Whatever confidence he'd walked in with that morning had cracked. The damage was done, not just to Gentry, but to every advantage Knoll thought he had secured behind closed doors. One of the federal agents held the door open as Gentry passed through. As it shut behind him, the sound echoed, sharp, final, like the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. But outside those courtroom walls, the real storm was just beginning, and Jasmine had no idea how far this would ripple. Outside the courthouse, the day had rolled on like any other. Sunlight on concrete, traffic humming past, people in suits with coffee cups in one hand and phones in the other. But that quiet broke the moment the courthouse door swung open. Federal agents moved with purpose. The crowd outside, mostly reporters and a few curious onlookers, surged forward the second they saw the handcuffs. Some gasped, some shouted questions, but Judge Ronald Gentry didn't respond. He looked straight ahead, as if staring through the crowd, eyes fixed on some point far beyond the concrete steps. He hadn't covered his face. He didn't yell or argue. He just looked deflated, like the realization had fully landed. All the years on the bench, all the cases, the accolades, the authority, it didn't mean a thing now. Jasmine Crockett exited the courthouse minutes later through a different side door. No escort, no entourage, just Rena beside her, holding the now empty folder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. A swarm of reporters turned when they spotted her, rushing toward the street to meet her. Microphones, cameras, rapid-fire questions. "Congresswoman, was this planned in advance? Did you intend to expose the judge today? Do you think this affects the credibility of the justice system?" She paused on the curb, then turned slowly. "I was called to testify," she said calmly. "I did just that. What happened after is a result of choices made long before I walked into that room." "But were you expecting federal agents?" "I was expecting to be interrupted. I was expecting to be dismissed. I was not expecting accountability, but I welcome it." With that, she crossed the street, her steps measured, almost slow. The flashing cameras didn't seem to faze her. It was like she'd trained herself long ago not to blink when the lights came on. Inside the courthouse, staff members exchanged stunned glances. Some whispered, others didn't say a word. In a small office on the second floor, a law clerk stared down at a printed email thread with her name on it. She swallowed hard. In the basement holding area, Judge Gentry sat on a bench, cuffed to the wall, the same bench that once held defendants he'd sentenced. He stared at the opposite wall, jaw clenched, a slow breath escaping his nose. The arrest was already everywhere. Local news stations were breaking the story live, headlines flashing on phones across Dallas. Federal judge detained during trial. Congresswoman Crockett at center of shocking turn. Back in the courtroom, Perry Knoll's team was frantically filing motions to pause the trial, citing judicial compromise and potential mistrial. The prosecutor looked exhausted, hunched over a desk, reviewing every line of evidence with new eyes. And Jasmine? She was gone before noon. She didn't stick around for interviews or panels. She didn't call in favors or post a statement online. She and Rena rode quietly in the back of a black SUV, headed to a nearby meeting with a local housing board. She's going to spin this, Rena said, finally breaking the silence. No, Jasmine, be brave. She's going to ignore it. Rena glanced over. You sure? Completely. People like him, they count on things staying buried. What they never count on is someone willing to hold the shovel. They didn't say much else for the rest of the ride. As the courthouse emptied and the agents finalized paperwork inside the field office, one truth remained. Justice wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't arrive with fanfare. It looked like a woman calmly reading from a folder no one wanted opened. But while the judge had been removed, the case wasn't over, and Jasmine knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to silence the truth. The footage spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, clips of Judge Gentry being let out in cuffs had gone viral, airing on cable news, circulating across social media, replayed in slow motion with commentary on every major channel. But the moment people kept replaying the most wasn't the arrest. It was Jasmine Crockett, seated calmly at the witness table, asking the judge, "Do you have any financial interest in the outcome of this trial?" Her tone, her poise, her refusal to play into the judge's game, it all struck a chord. By the end of the day, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Crockett held the line. Hashtag judicial accountability. Hashtag receipts don't lie. Back in Washington, some of her colleagues were already issuing statements, some supportive, some cautious. A few chose silence, trying to gauge which way public sentiment would fall. But Jasmine didn't respond to any of it. She wasn't on Twitter that evening. She wasn't watching TV interviews. She was on her back porch in Oak Cliff, shoes off, sipping lemon tea with her father, Reggie. He'd flown in after catching the news on television. "You held yourself like your mama used to in those meetings," he said, voice rough with pride. "Didn't let that man rattle you one bit." Jasmine smiled softly. "She always told me silence could be louder than shouting." Reggie nodded. "Well, today you didn't just speak. You said something the courtroom will never forget." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of cicadas filling the evening air. The folder, now a symbol of the moment, rested on the small patio table between them. Its tabs were bent, pages worn from use. Jasmine looked down at it for a second. "It shouldn't have taken this much," she said quietly. "People had those documents for months. Someone should have spoken up long before I had to." Reggie didn't disagree. He just took another sip of tea and said, "That's how power works, baby. It makes people nervous, makes them wait for someone else to go first." And maybe that's what it all came down to, being willing to go first. Not because it was easy, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because staying quiet wasn't an option. The next morning, federal prosecutors announced a formal investigation into several of Judge Gentry's past rulings. Whispers of campaign finance violations, bias in sentencing, and even off-record favors were beginning to surface. Other names were being mentioned too, quietly, cautiously. People who once stood beside Gentry were now backing away. As for the trial, it was reassigned to another judge within 48 hours. The prosecution was given a temporary delay to reorganize. Jasmine wasn't called back to testify. Her part was done, but what she had started had already reshaped the case. Outside the courthouse days later, a woman approached her, mid-40s, business attire, looked like she'd come straight from work. "I saw what you did," she said, eyes locked with Jasmine's, "and I just want to say thank you. My daughter's watching, and she needed to see a woman stand her ground like that." Jasmine smiled, shook her hand. "Tell her it wasn't about standing tall. It was about standing still when the ground shook." The woman nodded, eyes misty, then walked off. Jasmine turned to Rena, who had watched the entire exchange from a few feet away. "She's right," Rena said. "That courtroom wasn't just about Knoll or Gentry. It was about all of us who've been dismissed, interrupted, doubted." Jasmine looked up at the courthouse. It wasn't big, wasn't grand, just a building of stone and glass like thousands of others across the country. And yet, something had changed there. This story won't end up in a textbook. It might not even make it past the next news cycle. But the people who watched it unfold, they'll remember. And maybe next time, someone else will be holding the folder, someone younger, someone braver, someone who now knows they don't have to wait for permission to speak truth. Because silence protects power, but truth spoken clearly, calmly, and without apology can shake the walls it hides behind. If this story moved you, share it, speak up, stay sharp, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. Lesson: in a world where power often silences the marginalized, Jasmine Crockett's story is a potent reminder that truth, when wielded with courage and precision, can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of corruption. It's a lesson in the enduring power of evidence, the quiet strength of composure, and the unwavering belief that accountability is not a privilege, but a right. It's a call to action, urging us to be the ones who hold the shovel, to stand still when the ground shakes, and to never underestimate the seismic impact of a single, truthful voice. Reflection and call to vigilance. Jasmine's stand wasn't just about a corrupt judge. It was a reflection of the systemic battles fought daily in countless rooms, in whispers and shouts, in boardrooms and back alleys. It was about the insidious ways power can warp and decay, and the quiet, persistent work it takes to restore balance. This story isn't a neat, closed chapter. The forces that allowed Judge Gentry's unchecked power to fester are still at work, subtly, insidiously. The fight for justice is never truly over. It demands our continued vigilance, our willingness to question, to challenge, and to remember that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a single voice, armed with truth, can change the course of history. We must remain alert, not just for the grand, dramatic moments, but for the quiet, everyday injustices that erode the foundations of fairness. Because the power to hold those in authority accountable resides not just in courtrooms, but in the collective conscience of a people who refuse to be silenced. And that power, if nurtured and exercised, can reshape the world one truthful word at a time. Remember that each of us can be the one holding the shovel, the one standing firm when the ground shakes. Don't wait for someone else. Be the change you want to see. This story isn't just about one woman. It's about the power of community, about standing together for the truth. Let's build a world where truth always prevails. No matter how thick the darkness, a single flame of truth can light the way. Keep that flame burning bright.